Well, we in Rockville pride ourselves on our support of art and humanities, and basically we have a Viz Arts building here, and we also strongly support the performing arts at the F. Scott Fitzgerald Theater, and these are the literary arts, and they do need as much recognition as the other three art pieces.
Every year, the city of Rockville celebrates F. Scott Fitzgerald with a literary conference named in his honor, commemorating his legacy and lifelong connection with the city.
Well, I love that Fitzgerald has these strong ties to the area, and, you know, people always wonder, how did he end up being buried in Rockville, of all places? His family had lived here for generations. When he was a little kid, he used to go there and visit his grandparents. His parents actually got married in a house that no longer stands in downtown D.C., and his daughter ended up living here. Scotty became a journalist and lived in D.C. for a long time. And when Fitzgerald died, he was originally supposed to be buried in the family plot. That was the plan. But there were some problems. He was not a practicing Catholic at the time of his death. You have heard all the stories about what he was like. And the church actually initially said no. He was buried in the Rockville Union Cemetery in December 1940, and then his daughter Scotty later got the Catholic diocese to reconsider so that he could be in the family plot. So he was then reburied in St. Mary's, which is where you'll find his grave today. But we remember him fondly here. And The Great Gatsby is just a classic of American literature. It rewards rereading. It is beautifully written.
Well, we do have 10 workshops, and they cover everything, the fiction, non-fictions, how to get published, how you overcome, how you get known, and all this other stuff. So, I mean, it covers the entire gamut of publishing and writing.
Led by prominent writers in their respective fields, the workshops and panel discussions draw hundreds of aspiring writers searching for the recipe for great writing. What they discover in the midst of this celebration of the literary arts is the shared essential ingredient, the love of writing.
On one level, we're just trying to get by each day. On another level, we're trying to kind of figure out where we belong, you know, what our fate is. And that's, you know, storytelling is just a critical tool in that, whether it's nonfiction or fiction.
What I love about writing is that pure invention. I have also studied mathematics and dabbled in engineering, and I'm related to a lot of engineers. And that notion of making something, and making something new that works, that no one ever thought of before.
I love then seeing these words come to life the way I want them, and sometimes they don't.
I love giving voice to the stories that don't have a voice.
It was a creative writing class, and that class did change my life. I mean, it just, the power of short stories and what you do with short stories just knocked me out. At that point, I thought I wanted to write for television and movies, and after that class, I never had that thought again. You know, for me, it was all about literature and what you could do through character and sense of scene and dialogue and tension, and I just, that's the thing I've been chasing ever since.
You get up in the morning and you know it's going to be you and that blank sheet of paper in front of you, and you can do with that blank sheet of paper virtually anything. You are in total control. If anything's going to happen, it has to come from you.
What I love about poetry is the way it can transform daily experience into something larger than itself, something transcendent.
So many stories change me in some small way that I don't always know at the time, and in a lot of ways that is the mark of great writing, that it shows you the world through some new lens that you hadn't seen before.
The task of a writer, which is basically to create a world, either an entirely made-up world, or in the case of a historian, which is what I'm doing more recently, recreate a world from the past and somehow make it more compelling to somebody than the real life that they're living.
You know, it's often forgotten that one of the obligations of a writer is to entertain the reader. I mean entertain in any sense of the word. It can go from a funny little satire to a deeply serious book. But if you engage the reader's interest, you're entertaining the reader. And I've always felt that entertainment should not be just taken lightly. If you can't interest the reader in a book review or in a novel or in a short story, you're not doing your job. If you can't draw the reader in and make that person want to go to the end, you're not performing a function that is an obligation of a writer.
And there's so many ways to engage a reader. There's language, there's plot, there's setting, there's sometimes you'll read a story and say, this is exactly who my people are, and you've captured it.
I sit there and I look and I want to say something deep and philosophical and full of wisdom. I don't want to just, this is what I'm feeling. I'm very critical.
Writing a book, writing a short story isn't easy. I think that a lot of people in this self-esteem age are encouraged to believe that you can just sit down and write about yourself and everybody's going to be interested. That's not true. You have to make it interesting, and making it interesting is hard.
So many people write poetry, and so many people feel, oh, I wrote 3 poems today. And I don't see how they can in their process, and maybe we have different processes, but I labor over every word that's going to be in my line, and maybe that's why I don't write very long poems. But to me, every word has to have its weight, and every line has to have its weight.
Well, I think that writing always has to be, on one level, a process of discovery. I think a lot of aspiring writers make the mistake of coming to the task of writing with an idea already in their heads of what they want to say, how they want to say it, how their story is going to develop. And I think that that is a recipe for failure, because it leads to a kind of narrative that just tells us what we already know, or what we already think we know.
And so, some of us, I think, come to conferences looking for, I'll get the quick formula, I'll get something that will teach me to become a writer now, that will, and will help me make a connection. And connections help, but it's not going to get the writing done. And the writing gets done with your apprenticeship as a writer who sits down to the table every day for weeks and weeks and months and years, and often fails. But amidst those failures come our successes.
The process is one of experimentation, and I think writers should not be afraid to write badly, to fail.
When you're sitting there and you say, I know this is so late, nothing's going to come out, and then a couple hours later, you went, wow, let's go. It worked. And then you go to bed and sleep on it, and then you wake up, and if it's still working in the morning, then you get this feeling. And that feeling, then you crave, and you're addicted to that feeling.
Well, nothing about the writing process is easy. Nothing about the actual execution in terms of just sitting down and getting the pages out. And then, I mean, there's a lot of back and forth editorially that we actually do with our clients before the manuscript ever, makes it over to the publishing house.
One thing that worries me about the internet and the computer culture generally is that it's easier for people to do their writing without it's being read by editors or people who know more than they do. I think this is particularly important for young writers. I am not an admirer of the writing school, but I do believe that people who want to write need to have good early readers before they're published, people who can help them with the most basic matters of grammar, who can help them pull their books together.
Having a mentor is so important in the writing process.
A lot of times people will say, if you want to be a good writer, you have to read. And I do think that that's accurate. I'm not saying that that's not true. That is true. But I think really, if you want to be a good writer, you really have to write.
I think most often it comes back to the characters, and once they come to life, then it's almost like you have a duty to see them through their story, and you would be abandoning them if you weren't writing the sentences that it takes to get them through that journey. Because a lot of times it does come down to even word by word. You know, are you writing precisely and honestly? Are you capturing the world through their eyes and not imposing your own idea of what you want to tell the reader?
Good writing is pretty arresting, no matter what the subject matter is.
The story itself is essential. If you don't have a good story, you're not going to be able to engage your readers' interests or your moviegoers' interests or your television watchers or whatever. Obviously, you need characters, not necessarily that the reader can identify with, but that the reader can understand and become interested in and care about.
A figure that rises up almost on the page with a complicated life, with nuances and contradictions, just like the people we know in real life. A character that ideally should have taken the writer a while to get to know.
My challenge is to make them distinct without just being ridiculous. And that's a lot of problems new writers have. Put these quirks, amassing them. Now make your little Frankenstein breathe and make the movements much more fluid.
Keep it simple, keep it straightforward, tell a story, make sure the story moves, make sure people care about the characters. You know, I talk about various problems that authors run into. One is what I call the Russian novel problem. Russian novels have too many characters and too many plots. They're kind of like real life. So you got to winnow down the characters and make sure the plot is simple. I mean, it doesn't have to be as bang-bang as, say, a thriller in a movie, but you got to hold the reader's attention and pay attention to that.
I'm reading about a character that I've never met and probably never going to meet because I'm the editor, not the reporter. And this story takes me into a place that I don't know, you know, and makes me care about these characters. So over the course of many thousands of words later, I'm really moved to find out what this character does, what decision this character makes, the heartbreak that this character endures, and I haven't left my chair.
So much of it is feel and sound and emotional impact. Did I catch this? Is this vivid enough?
I have never written a character that corresponded to somebody I knew in real life. But there are bits and pieces of all kinds of people that I know in the characters I've written. So it's kind of a composite process.
My stories come from life. You know, sometimes they come from some newspaper headline that I read that then gets kind of twisted or filtered, you know, and then finds its way into a story that I hadn't really anticipated. Sometimes my inspiration comes from my own family.
They start with an idea, they start with some sort of germ, and almost improvise. There's a famous story about William Faulkner, who was he started his novel Light in August, and he said all he had in his head was an image of a barefoot pregnant woman walking down a dirt road in Mississippi. And from there he created a 500-page novel.
I'll hear a line in my head and I'll just be curious about who that was that said that, and I'll want to know their story, and I'll just kind of begin to write from there. So I write very intuitively. I don't really plan out a plot and then decide on a character and put them in the plot.
What do you know that you don't know you know? That's intuition. If you make it up, but you're relying on all of the gray matter that's orbiting inside there, is that imagination or intuition? So I was working for years on my second novel about a woman who was pregnant and didn't know she was pregnant. And then I got pregnant, and I did not know I was pregnant. I had already had a child. Those symptoms were not foreign to me. I know how pregnancy works. And when that happened, I was so shocked. And then, of course, I had to live the horrible pregnancy I had written for her. So my editor said to me, "You're the only person I know who got pregnant by writing."
You know, looking back, I remember when I first started school, I was so shy that my teachers thought that I had a mental handicap. And my mom had to actually record me reading out loud The Cat in the Hat and then bringing in the tape to prove to them that you know, I was okay. And so I think from that moment on, I was 3 years old at the time, but I had the feeling that books can change a life. And just a few years later, I wrote my first short story about a mouse who has no friends because she can't talk to people or talk to fellow mice. And then it's only when she gets on a roller coaster and starts screaming that she finds her voice. So I think writing to me is still wrapped up in that, just the terror and also the thrill of making yourself heard.
I think the fact that we are not, you know, New York is about money and it's about art, Washington is about politics.
I think a lot of aspiring writers have kind of a romanticized notion about what it is to be a writer, and there are many wonderful aspects to it, of course, but it's also a lot of really hard work. It's a lot of lonely work. It's work that requires putting up with a lot of rejection before you attain any amount of success. But it is also one of the most rewarding and exhilarating things you can do with your life.
Everyone knows that, you know, it's a really tough market and it's not getting any easier, especially with some, you know, electronic books and a lot of e-media in general really taking off. The writing process is very involved, and we have a commercial perspective about what publishers are looking for and what's going to sell that I feel like sometimes authors don't have. And so that can be a challenge to kind of, you know, hone and focus your work in a way that's going to make it more appealing to a broader audience and to a potential publisher. Sometimes it really is the idea that I latch onto, and sometimes it's the style. Like someone just has a really unique way of describing something or, you know, explaining an issue. And there's nothing more exciting than talking to someone who has a great idea or who you can tell has a lot of talent and helping them to put that out there in the world.
Anne Lamott's Bird by Bird, which one of the things that really sticks out to me is just this hilarious description of what it's like when the day that your book comes out, you know, you kind of think that trumpets will be blaring and you know, flowers will be arriving on your doorstep, and in reality maybe the phone rings once, you know. so you know, and some people that might seem kind of discouraging, but for me I actually just think that that it's liberating, that, you know, we do what we do for the love of it and not for any pot of gold at the end of the rainbow.
We'll always need people to tell stories.